Okay, we're going to get started. First of all, thank you all for being here this morning. I hope you all had a great Valentine's Day. We're going to be doing a pretty sharp pivot from love being in the air from last night to talking about new and different ways that the youth of America can give us all agita. I think free speech is something that's very misunderstood. Some of you may be familiar with a movie from the 1980s called The Princess Bride. There was a character in that movie that kept on using the word inconceivable. And finally, another character says to him, I don't think that word means what you think it means. And to be sure, a lot of people think the First Amendment is absolute and that people can say whatever they want, wherever they want. And that's just not the law. And we're going to talk this morning. I'm going to talk about the Supreme Court cases that on First Amendment law and some other circuit court cases that have come down and give you a general overview about speech, particularly on social media, which has become a major problem just in the last few weeks. I have had 3 matters with threats in chat rooms that were reported to the school district. And we're going to find out that those threats are not protected free speech. And we're going to also talk a little bit about political speech, which is certainly something that's going on a lot now. We see it mostly in colleges, but we are seeing it also in public schools as well. And with that, we're going to ease into the topic with something not even remotely controversial. So here we have the testimony. Some of you may have seen this before Congress of the college presidents.
And Dr. Gay, at Harvard, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment? Yes or no?
It can be, depending on the context.
So my practice actually includes both K through 12 schools and universities, and defending a lot of these cases right now. And that answer to that question has stoked, obviously, a lot of controversy. So what if one of our superintendents of schools was being asked that question? What would the answer be? Would it be that it depends on context? And I would submit to you, no, that calling for the genocide of anyone, whether it be based on religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, is not protected free speech. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that is and how the case law supports that notion that it's not protected. But I do want to use this as somewhat of a teachable moment here. My understanding is part of what went wrong with the testimony of the college presidents is that they may have been over-prepared by their attorneys to give very nuanced answers. I think they were concerned about anything that they said being misconstrued to say that no one has the right to make political statements. And I think that they were so concerned about that they got trapped on their own, trying to be vague and nuanced. And I have to say, I have found that even in my own practice, there is somewhat of a tendency to do that. We've had situations where something has gone on at school. Let's say there was a bomb threat or a shooter threat, and the school wants to give out information. And there's a lot of talk about, well, what do we say? Because everyone has become so concerned that whatever they say, the naysayers in the community will twist those words to suit whatever narrative they're trying to sell to the rest of the public. And I think one thing that we learned from this testimony is that as much as it gets tempted to try to fit your words so as not to be criticized, sometimes the best thing to do is just keep with things very simple. The simplicity of truth, as cheesy as that sounds, because this went terribly wrong for the universities. The presidents wound up being terminated, a lot of lost donations. There's lawsuits pending, and I'm going to talk a little bit, and investigations from the Office of Civil Rights, which I'm going to get to in a second. So if we can go actually to the next slide.
Visuals.
Okay, so whenever we talk about student free speech, this is going to be the main case we talk about, the Tinker case. This is where you had students protesting the Vietnam War. They wore black armbands, and this was silent, passive political speech, and they were nonetheless disciplined for doing this. This is the case where the Supreme Court made their famous statement that students do not shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gates. I remember the first time hearing about the Tinker case. I was in what was then called junior high, but now middle school. And I came home and told my parents about how I did not shed my rights at the schoolhouse gates. This was a different era, and my parents begged to differ with that statement. And they said, well, other students may have the right to free speech in school. Your rights are only to remain silent and do your homework, and you can just be quiet. So this is this case. I want to go to the second point here. So we know about that speech can't is not protected if it interferes with the orderly functions of the school. But also, point number two is very important. It impinges upon the rights of others. So let's go back to the testimony of the Harvard president. Obviously, calling for the genocide of a group of people impinges upon the rights of others. It is not protected speech. The other thing is that, again, the First Amendment doesn't stand alone. It has to be read in conjunction with other laws. So those laws include DASA, the Dignity Act, which prevents bullying, Title VI, which is a federal law, which protects against discrimination based on religion and on race. So what you do see now is, because of the testimony of the presidents and what's going on in those campuses, the United States Department of Education is conducting investigations of those universities, and they have the authority to rule that those universities lose federal funds because of their violations of Title VI. We also have Title IX, which prevents against harassment based on gender. So people have tried to say, well, my sexual harassment is protected free speech. No, it is not. And then we also have the Civil Rights Law and the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution, which also protects against discrimination based on certain categories, such as race, religion, sexual orientation. And those allow private lawsuits, not just against a school district, but against individuals who have engaged in the conduct or allowed the conduct to happen. So again, we go back to what was said at Harvard, and under our Tinker standard, that speech would not be protected. Next slide, please. So the cases that follow Tinker, and these are all at the Supreme Court level, we have the Bethel School District case versus Frazier. You had a student here making a nominating speech before other students in an auditorium for his friend to be class president. And the speech was laced with sexual innuendo, and it made other students feel very uncomfortable. And he gets suspended for this. And the Supreme Court rules in favor of the school district here, saying that when you have a captive audience, you can certainly censor speech and punish for speech that is lewd and vulgar. Just a confession here, when I first read the Bethel case, I was in law school, so I was still in my 20s. And I thought, yeah, the speech was inappropriate, but the school district was being a little uptight in suspending the child. Now we fast forward a few years later, when I have become a parent of a little girl. And now all of a sudden I'm thinking that corporal punishment was in order for this student. So things change. The Hazelwood case, there you had a school-sponsored newspaper. Students wanted to do stories about teen pregnancy and suicide. And the school felt that those weren't appropriate for this publication. Because the school had editorial control over the newspaper, they were allowed to censor speech that was inconsistent with its own pedagogical interest. And the concern the school had was that, first of all, talking about pregnancy, or they were also talking about divorce, that it would out certain people, and they felt that privacy should rule the day, and that was ruled in favor of the school district. The next case comes in 2007. You had a school district in Alaska, and the Olympic torch was coming through the town, and everyone was very excited, and the schools were let out early so the students could attend the celebration of when the torch ran through. And as the torch was coming through, a bunch of students rolled out a banner saying "Bong hits for Jesus." School administrators tend to frown upon bong hits for anyone, let alone for Jesus. So they disciplined these students. Now, the court ruled in favor of the school again, this time saying, this was not political speech. This was just advocating drug use. And school districts can regulate speech that encourages the use of illegal drugs. The next case. I'm sorry, Kathy, next slide. So this is the most recent case that came down a couple of years ago, the Mahanoy case. So you had on a Saturday at a local store with friends, a student named Brandy was upset for not making the varsity cheerleading squad. And she posted a photo of her Snapchat story with F school, F softball, F cheer, F everything, with a picture of her and her friend putting up their middle finger. Next slide. So several students were upset about this, and they reported their concerns to the school. The coaches suspended Brandy from cheerleading for a year, stating her actions violated the team rules, requiring respect for others, and discouraging foul language and inappropriate gestures. Next slide. A federal appeals court in Pennsylvania, the Third Circuit, held that because the speech was on off campus, there was absolutely protected. When it went up to the Supreme Court, the court still ruled in favor of the student, but it said schools could regulate off-campus speech, but their ability to do so is diminished. So there was no disruption to the team. There was no bullying, no fighting words, and there was no and then the words were vulgar but not obscene. So based on this case, they did carve out exceptions, and the exceptions were that if off-campus speech involved severe harassment, bullying, or threats of violence, that could be regulated. Can we go to the next slide? So again, this is what I was just talking about earlier. I have had cases since Mahanoy, and I have them now, and sadly 3 in the last couple of weeks, where students made bomb threats or active shooter threats in private chat rooms. And somebody in the chat forwarded it to the school, and the students were disciplined. And some of the students have raised free speech issues, and under Mahanoy even, threats of violence, harassment, and bullying are not protected free speech. There are several cases out there that says once you go into a social media forum, you need to assume that even though your chat is ostensibly private, that anyone could forward what you've done or take a screenshot of what you are saying and forward it to someone else. So the fact that you think your discussion is private online is not going to get you protected, particularly when that discussion involves harassing somebody else or making a threat towards the school. Next slide, please. So after Mahanoy, there have been several cases that come down. Just in the interest of time, and anyone, by the way, can get a copy of this PowerPoint that has all these cases outlined. But the reason just putting them there, that these cases are following a theme of violence, racist statements, things along those lines are not protected, but simple satire or innocuous political speech or comments are still going to remain protected after Mahanoy. And if we could go one more slide. So again, these are just more cases, and It's sad to see just how litigious we have become, that everything is being litigated these days. And, one would hope that if a student makes a racist statement online, the parent might be inclined to side with the school district in imposing discipline. But it certainly seems nowadays that every student has a lawyer locked into their contacts on their phone and can FaceTime with them in the blink of an eye. So, but again, the school districts have a lot of authority here still to regulate hateful speech. Next slide, please. So the big picture again is that there is still authority to regulate speech, but it's not absolute. And certain speech is still protected when it's offline and it's not causing any disruption to the school. And I think what the court here was being concerned about is that they didn't want students, we can't live in a world where students are worried about everything they do or say is going to result in discipline. So let me go back to a simpler time and give an illustration of this. So let's say in the days before social media, a student gets cut from their high school sports team. They're in their local pizza place and they start complaining about the coach and how unfair the coach is. And they use colorful language to describe that coach. And little do they know, in the booth next to them, somebody is listening in and they report it to the school. Ought they really be suspended for that? It seems to me, and I think this is what the court was concerned about, that would be a little Orwellian to suspend a student for that. That would be Big Brother watching you all the time. That would make every statement at a playground or on a schoolyard basketball court after hours subject to discipline. And again, unless that speech is somehow going to threaten the school itself or bully someone else, I think the court is worried about there being overreach on the part of school districts. Now, the fact that you can't suspend doesn't mean there's nothing you can do about it. You still can use teachable moments. So if something is reported to you about students saying something online, it may not be something you necessarily can or would even want to discipline for. But you can have a discussion about what's going on with the student and how their comments are being perceived. Another thing I think that's important for students to know, and this is something they still don't learn, is that when they say things on social media, it can be captured forever. And it could be found by a college looking at their application for admission, law school looking at their application for admissions, and down the road, employers looking at things. And we have seen people get fired for engaging in what would otherwise be protected speech, and not understanding that once it's on the network, it's there forever, and it could have consequences. I see there's a question in the chat room. Okay, so I just want to answer this question as we're going along. And it says, if a staff member has a large Free Palestine sticker above their desk, and someone else has an I stand with Israel, are we allowed to prohibit this? What would be the policy? Is their law protected? Very good question. This goes into staff free speech. So here's the rule on this. You can't engage in viewpoint discrimination, but you can say your workplace is not appropriate to proselytize your political views to your students. There is a case called Weingarten out of our federal district court in the Eastern District of New York. And in that case, teachers were wearing campaign buttons, and school said you can't do that. And the teacher sued, and the court sided with the school. So here's what, to me, what the rule ought to be. Your classroom ought to be for your classroom. It's not for you to advertise your political views, but that rule has to be blanket and it has to be uniformly enforced. You can't be selective. So you can't say the Free Palestine sticker can stay, but not the I stand with Israel, and vice versa. But I think a school should clamp down on this. I don't think it's appropriate to have warring political messages. So we saw this with the masks during COVID. I remember dropping off one of my kids at school, and we saw the Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, and everyone had a political mask. And I don't think people have to run that gauntlet of what staff think what their political messages are. And a school can have a uniform policy, no political speech in your classroom. I hope that answered it. And by the way, if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to call me. I have had occasion to litigate these kind of things. And I'll be happy to talk that through with you offline. Okay, next slide. So this is a case out of our Second Circuit. It was handled actually by our colleagues in our Syracuse office. This was pre-Mahanoy, but we recently had a court say that this is still good law. Again, you had a middle school student sending instant messages to classmate, displaying a picture of a bullet being fired at his head. And underneath it said, kill a teacher. And the teacher was actually understandably very upset about this in this day and age. Anytime a student says that, you have to assume that that threat is real. The student tried to defend himself by saying it was meant only as a joke, and that this was private speech. And that argument was rejected by our Second Circuit. Next slide, please. So in the Doniger case, this case we had an event called Jam Fest at the school, and it was canceled. And you had a student email a bunch of people saying Jam Fest is canceled due to the douchebags in central office. Again, as you can imagine, central office staff frown upon being called douchebags, and there was discipline for this. Now, the question is, does this case still good law after the Mahanoy case? How is it different? I think it is, and I think the difference is, in this case, the student actually directed disruption at the school. So encouraged other students to try to disrupt the school. But again, with each of these things, I think it's a good idea to call us in advance of any discipline that you're going to do. And again, the fact that you can discipline doesn't mean that you're going to want to, as opposed to doing teachable moments. Next slide, please. One more. Okay, political speech. So you had a student wear a shirt that predicted George Bush as a chicken hawk and an alcoholic and cocaine user. Actually, can you go to this to the slide? That's the actual shirt. And the question is, could this student be told to take this shirt off, or was it protected free speech? And this shirt was held by the court to be protected free speech. People may not have liked it, but it is a political message. It's not threatening in any way, and it's just someone's political point of view. Next slide. Another one, again, around the same time, George Bush is an international terrorist. This again was held to be protected free speech. One more slide, please. And I'm just going to skip through this one as well. Confederate flags, we have actually had this come up. There is a split in the courts about whether wearing a Confederate flag is protected or not protected. We think the better reasoned rule is that it is not protected free speech, that wearing of the correct Confederate flag will be offensive to other students. It is associated with hate speech and hateful acts. And although there's no case in New York on it, we think that a court would rule that that symbol in and of itself is likely to cause disruption. And disruption being impinging upon the rights of others. Next slide. And so this is a case that goes the other way. Again, a split in the courts across the country on this, which is not entirely surprising. Next slide. This is a very interesting case. A student wore a shirt that says there are only two genders. And, I think this is a close case, but the court, in the context of an injunction, which would be to stop the school district from the removal, ruled in favor of the school district here. So why? And if we look at our guidance on transgender students and our DASA obligations, this could be deemed to be harassment of transgender students and creating an environment where they don't feel comfortable. It would be akin to the Confederate flag, in my view, in terms of a symbol that makes people feel that they are not welcome in the school. So I think that decision is correct, and I think that would be one we would want to follow. Next slide. So here I've gotten questions about this, the MAGA hat and the Let's Go Brandon hat, or I guess there's now all manner of outerwear you can get with these symbols. And these are protected speech. Now I have had a question about, well, somebody wears the MAGA hat and a bunch of other students start yelling at them and it creates disruption in the classroom. Then aren't we in the Tinker standard where this is no longer protected speech? The answer to that, I think, is no. It's still protected speech. And the reason why, the fact that some other students are offended by it, there's a concept in law called a heckler's veto. And we don't give hecklers the rights to quash the First Amendment rights of other people. So what's the remedy then? Well, you discipline the students who are harassing the student wearing a MAGA hat. You don't say to the MAGA hat, or if it was a Biden hat, well, you can't wear that anymore because these other students are going to try to interfere with your rights to do so. Next slide. Okay, so this goes to the question that was somewhat asked before. Let's look at these two. So if we have a Free Palestine shirt and a student wore exactly that shirt into a school district today, could we say to the student, you can't wear that? And the answer is no. Free Palestine is a political message, and it's Free Palestine in and of itself is not hateful speech, just like I stand with Israel, if that was on a shirt that somebody wore, is protected political speech. Now, if we look at the other one, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, that I would submit to you can be censored. The reason why is that has a connotation of genocide, that we're going to wipe Jews out of Israel. And that's where the difference lies. So again, now, one thing you can do, so let's say a student did wear that shirt into school. What I've observed from college students being interviewed by reporters is a lot of those students don't understand what that shirt even means. First of all, they don't know the geography of where Gaza even is, and they don't understand historically what that message really means. They just think that this is a shirt that is protesting the depth of the Israeli response to October 7th. So again, the fact that we can engage in discipline doesn't mean we have to. We can try to explain to students what this actually means and why it would be offensive to other people. And if that works, then we don't have to be, named in somebody's school law outline as a case that involved you. But if they insist, then you would have to take action for it, because again, allowing that shirt to be worn could in and of itself be a DASA violation to Jewish students. Same with the Confederate flag on the shirt. Next slide. So again, this has to do with another controversial issue, pro-life. Again, people can engage in political speech. They can have pro-life shirts, pro-life armbands, and again, that's protected speech. Next slide. This had to do with a rap song that somebody posted online that carried offensive speech. And again, this is, even under Mahanoy, this is still good law, that a student can take action for off-campus speech. Next slide. So again, this talks about, this is from the case with the rap song. Technology can make things go viral in a second and encourage people to engage in violence, and also make people very uncomfortable in the blink of an eye. So technology is informing the law. One more slide, please. So I'm going to talk about this case one more time. This is pretty much my favorite First Amendment case. So you had a fourth grader, and this is a school district that won a trip to see the Minnesota Vikings football team. So the school was in Minnesota, and a student, Rocky, wanted to wear his Green Bay Packers shirt on this field trip to the Vikings training camp. Now, I bring this up. I have been a Vikings fan since I was 4 years old. For anyone who may be familiar with football, the Vikings have famously lost 4 Super Bowls. So every year when my wife sees me getting ready to start the season rooting for the Vikings, she says, watching you root for the Vikings is like watching Linus in the pumpkin patch. It's just never going to happen for you. So let's say we did have this here, where we were going to do a trip to Jets training camp, and someone wanted to wear their New England Patriots jersey. So what would we do? Well, first we would send that student for counseling, because obviously if you're a Patriots fan, there's something going on. But we could nonetheless say that consistent with this trip, you cannot wear that shirt. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Sam, who's going to talk about some of the library cases.
All right, thanks, Howard. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit, like Howard said, and talk about book banning, which has been a hot topic recently. So in 1982, the Supreme Court decided Island Trees v. Pico. The Board of Ed of the Pico School District had banned books from its middle and high school libraries that it deemed anti-American, anti-Christian, anti-Semitic, and just plain filthy. The main question the court considered was if the First Amendment imposes limitations on the board's decision to do this. And the court ultimately held that the motivation for a book's removal must be the central factor in determining the constitutionality behind removing it. So if the purpose of banning the book is just to eliminate ideas the board disagrees with, then this violates the First Amendment. But if board officials can point to non-discriminatory reasons for the ban, like it's vulgar or it's unsuitable education-wise, or maybe even for spreading misinformation, which we will touch on later, then they're granted wide discretion to remove it. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. These were just the many books that were banned by the Board of Ed in the Pico case, including the popular anti-war novel Slaughterhouse-Five. Next slide, please. So after this decision, the Island Trees School Board voted to reinstate the banned books, but they placed this condition on it that any student checking them out had to take home a parental warning first, and this requirement did not last very long. It was found to have broken the law that protects the confidentiality of library records, and ultimately the board narrowly voted to return the books to the school libraries. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the book banning topic came up again in a case ACLU v. Miami-Dade in 2009, where a parent requested that the school remove this book called Vamos a Cuba, which explained to readers the geography, customs, language, and daily life in Cuba. He wanted it removed from his daughter's school library because he himself was a former political prisoner in Cuba, and he had firsthand experience there, and he knew that material in the book was not truthful. It portrayed a life in Cuba that does not exist. The school board did vote to remove not only this book, but the entire series of A Visit to books, and plan to replace them with a more accurate set of books. more representative of actual life in these countries. There was question as to whether or not this violated the First Amendment, but as I hinted to before, the court found that the board's action did not violate the First Amendment, as a school board can remove a book based upon numerous factual inaccuracies and misleading omissions therein. Next slide, please. Thanks. At the end of last year, the Southern District of Iowa was presented with GLBT Youth v. Reynolds, where educators, students, publishers, and authors filed actions against state defendants, challenging a statute which banned a multitude of things. First, it required books describing sex acts to be removed from public school libraries. Second, it forbids schools from providing programs, promotion, and instruction relating to gender identity or sexual orientation to students in 6th grade and lower. And third, it required the notification of a child's parents if they did request an accommodation relating to their gender identity. Plaintiffs moved for preliminary injunctions, and the court actually found in their favor on all fronts. Next slide, please. Next. So on the book banning component, the court found the students were likely to prevail on their claims that the book restrictions violated PICO. The publishers, authors, and students were likely to prevail on their overbreadth challenges to the restrictions, and the educators were likely to prevail on their argument that the book restrictions were void for vagueness and violated their right to due process. The court also found that the educators and students were likely to prevail on their argument pertaining to the program restrictions because they were void for vagueness. And ultimately, a preliminary injunction was appropriate to prohibit the state from enforcing this law as to the book and program restrictions, but the court did not engage in an analysis regarding the constitutionality of the parental notification requirement. And yeah, I believe that is the last slide.
So just some things about the books. So school districts can also say certain books are not age appropriate. We see that more and more. The language could be too graphic. Could depict violence that's too graphic. What some schools have done is to take certain books that may be of that nature and kind of put them in a special place where where students can come and request them, but you may need a permission slip for certain books. So that's one way to try to compromise these issues. I do see that there is a second question in the chat that's saying, to clarify, this is going back to the student free speech. Students can wear Free Palestine or I Stand With Israel shirt and stickers on their books, but staff cannot have the same if the employer chooses to ban. Yes, that is true. So the First Amendment rights of students and staff are different. That's because of the nature of how a teacher stands as role models and how a teacher can influence and shape the views of their students. So, growing up, I certainly never knew what the political beliefs of my teachers, and I really shouldn't know that because I might feel pressured into believing exactly what they believe. So you can have that. There is a case on Long Island about pride flags in the classroom and whether that opens the door to something else and whether you can have a uniform ban on that. And I think you can. I think if you're going to allow the pride flag, just like anything else in someone's classroom, then a conservative staff member may be able to take a different view. That's why I think it actually is a good idea to keep classrooms for academic matters and keep away from proselytizing political speech. Can't really make out the rest of the question, but whoever posted that, please feel free to call me. My number is 516-267-6318. I think we're going to end there, and we would welcome you calling me or Sam with any questions, and thank you for joining us early in the morning, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.